Good afternoon, everyone. Starr Sackstein here, coming to you from New York. Wanted to talk a little bit today about grading and the impact of traditional grades on learning and how we can really start thinking about alternative ways to consider grading in the classroom, other ways to provide feedback to both students and to other kinds of learners. And parents in particular, as we're trying to help students understand what they know and can do. When we think about grades in the traditional sense, too often grades are determined by teachers based on assignments that we have created ourselves, often without the students' input in really a lot of what's going on. So what we're trying to do differently is make sure that students are aware of, first of all, why they're being assessed on certain things, how it connects to the learning that's happening in school, how it's connected to their lives, and most importantly, how well they're doing against the standards that we're looking to assess, the skills that we're hoping for them to be learning in our classes. And the report cards that we do this with, as of right now, most schools, when they do report cards, particularly at the high school level, which is where I am. I teach this year 9th grade, 10th grade, and a mixed class of repeater students at the high school level, 9 to 12, all in one room. And when we think about what report card grades are, is essentially a snapshot of one time. And by the time the kids get those report cards, those grades that are placed on there are usually largely outdated. Sometimes for some people it's just exams that are sort of averaged together. Sometimes there's a class participation grade. Sometimes there are homework grades. If we even start talking about zeros, that could really mess up the average altogether. And when we think about averages by themselves, that's also problematic, because you could have a student who has some wildly different grades with wildly different skills, and maybe they're getting 90s on one subject area and they're getting 70s on others, and then you put those two together and they're somewhere in the 80s, and you have students with B's across the board with very, very, very different learning profiles. So those letters and numbers really don't communicate what we think they communicate. Many of us have that traditional thought of what grades mean, and we define ourselves by those grades. I know I did when I was in high school. Getting an A was very, very important to me, so I could certainly empathize with students who are really motivated by the grade. Unfortunately, if you ask me now what those grades, aside from, bolstering my ego, I'm not really sure those grades really told me anything about what I was learning and about how I could continue to grow as a learner. So what we could start doing differently, first of all, is not putting grades on everything students do. Put more emphasis on the process. Give students feedback all along the way. Be very, very intentional about it. Make sure that there is formative feedback going on that's actionable. It has strategies. It allows students to sort of do the things we want them to do. So if we're working on a particular skill set, we want to make sure that we're really zeroing in on that in their work, providing them with the strategies they need, and then having a conversation, a dialogue with them ongoing, so that they understand what the expectations are. We could tell them how they're doing against the standard until it gets to the point where they can recognize the growth that's going on. And that's the ultimate goal, getting kids to be really, really good communicators about their learning. And we could do that in a lot of different ways. When we start bringing reflection into everyday class, where we ask kids to think about how well they've gotten the concept that we've provided and how well they know that we've gotten that concept, we really want to make sure that what they're saying to us and what we're seeing is the same thing. And we have to norm that by helping them understand and identify what standards look like, what kind of exemplar work looks like, and the kind of things they're sort of striving for. And then we set what success criteria looks like together so that they know what they are looking for. We can also put them together in peer pairs, so that peers are providing them with excellent feedback. For those of you who work in cities like I do, If you have 34 kids in your class, it's probably unlikely that you will get to all 34 kids in any kind of meaningful way on a regular basis. So what you really need to make sure you're doing is making sure that kids are getting somebody looking at their work, and that ultimately we're seeing it ongoing. And then we again have them reflect, we have them assess themselves against the standards, whether you're using a rubric, a single point rubric where you have the standard in the middle, and then you're asking kids to talk about where they still need areas of growth and areas of proficiency and or mastery, and how do they know. One last thing I know that sort of came up earlier when I was on Twitter and people were asking me about this was, what would we replace the report cards with? Something we really need to start thinking about is portfolio assessment. Students should be allowed to select the work that they feel best represents their learning. They should have multiple pieces that they have selected, and they should be able to talk about the pieces they've selected, and more importantly even than that, why they've selected them. What about this work makes it exemplary? What about it is something that shows us about what's going on? We do also have to really make sure that we give people the opportunity to talk about areas where they still need to grow. And I think students right now have challenges thinking about the ways that as themselves as learners, because to be honest with you, they want teachers to validate what they're doing, and what we need to do is start shifting the paradigm so that kids don't see teachers as the only arbiter of how well they're doing. So much of the time, the work itself, for example, let's say you have a really gifted kid in a space, but they're not terribly motivated by what's going on, so they're not doing your work. And because they're not doing your work, you really don't have a very strong read on what they know and can do. So the best way that we could sort of do this, and we have a little bit of a drive-by here. My cat, this is Huxley the cat, named after Aldous Huxley. He wanted to be a part of this live little talk about grades. I'm reading Lorraine's right now. There should be a syllabus to be followed with a timeline, and then everything does complete within the year. And to be honest, Lorraine, that's how I used to do it in my AP class at my old school. Kids got a syllabus at the beginning of the year. We followed that syllabus, and there was still room, though, throughout the year to adjust what students were doing. They had product choices that they were allowed to kind of decide themselves. And something I really started getting involved with the students was making sure that these kids really had the opportunity to design the projects they were working on. So if you're in a project-based environment, it certainly lends itself a little bit more to formative feedback, because then you're teaching a skill, maybe whole class, you're doing a mini lesson, you're giving kids an opportunity to try. Maybe you've even designed the project together, which would be ideal. You backward planned together. You talked about the skills they were going to need to be successful, so success criteria came up before. And when kids are an integral part of that process, they certainly understand more, A, what they're working toward, B, why they're working toward it. And then they have some control on the choice of maybe some of the content that they're using in that capacity, and they also have choice in what the actual product looks like. Because standard skills could be shown in a variety of different ways, and we want to give kids as much ownership over that as possible. So once we determine what success criteria looks like, if we're having those ongoing conversations, then kids know where they are all along the way. If you're using some kind of online gradebook, an online communication system where assessment could be put up in front of parents as well, that's another way to keep communicating with parents ongoing. You really don't want to attach a grade to it. Maybe there are specific standards if you're using a standards-based situation where you could say, all right, on this standard today, your child was, proficient, and this is why, and this is where they still need to work. But we really need to make sure that the kids know that, so that when the kids sit down with their portfolio, they're able to say to their parents, you know, at the beginning of the year, I wasn't really so good at adding context into my introductory paragraph, but after working and getting feedback and having some mini lessons and reading some examples, I now know that when I'm trying to engage a reader, when I'm writing even an academic paper, there does need to be a level of context. So even having that academic vocabulary that they might not have before is something we really need to provide to kids when they're in this process, so that they could really own what they're doing. So I'm kind of curious, for those of you watching right now, what questions do you have about going gradeless, and what concerns do you have? Folks have asked me about transcripts. The way that it works for me in New York City is I generally conference with my students at the end of the year, and when I conference with them, they're to sort of defend their body of work. It's like a portfolio where they're choosing specific pieces. They have to be able to show something from various different parts of the Common Core standards. So they need to show me a few standards from the reading section, some for the writing section, some for listening and speaking, and they also have to work at showing me their language acquisition. So each piece of work that they're showing me, they need to show me how they feel they've met or exceeded or approached the standards through the body of work that they have. And then together we decide on what the grade's going to be on the report card. And ultimately what that does is it takes the fear out of report card time. They know exactly what's going on there. That's what's going to go on the transcript. And ultimately, they've had an entire year to get to that point. And that final grade that ends up on their report card is a full year's worth of work, rather than, you know, different segments of time. Semester grades, marking period grades, they're problematic because, like someone had mentioned earlier, different kids get different things at different times, and there's no way to know how fast some kids are going to learn something and how fast other kids are going to learn them. And we need to provide them with multiple opportunities to practice those standards, and for those kids who master them to flexibly move on to other things. And we could start pulling in goal setting, and we could pull on a bunch of different things that really, again, control the kind of feedback students are getting. For example, if a student is working on a project and they've already been working through cohesion and adding good evidence into their writing, and I've given them lots of different strategies, and those are two things they're working on very specifically in their academic writing. When they do their reflection at the end, they're going to tell me the strategies they employed and whether or not they feel that they've met those standards. And then when I read their work, I'm reading it through the lens of their reflection. So these were the goals they set for themselves. This is where they are right now. So the feedback I'm giving them is very directed to what they worked on. And if they have, in fact, exceeded the standards for the things that they were working on, then it's time to move on to something new. And every kid gets a different sort of, they get different focuses based on what they need. So I'm hoping that everybody watching is sort of buying into the fact that feedback is really what the most essential part of assessment is, giving kids what they need to be really successful. And I'm curious now if anybody has questions. I can't see. Scrolling through. Thanks for joining, those of you who are watching. It's really exciting to do this for the first time through Education Week Teacher. I'm kind of hoping that I could get some folks who could be interested in giving this a go and share how it goes for them. Well, if that is all for now, if nobody's got questions, you can always reach me on Twitter at Miss Sackstein. You could read my blog, Work in Progress. I write a lot about assessment. I've also written the book Hacking Assessment with the Hack Learning series, which basically helps folks start to get rid of grades. That is really, really cool. Outcome-based education, yep. Portfolios are an essential part, Lorraine. I'm totally with you there. Why did it fail? I'm curious about that. Thank you so much for coming. Wow, from Madrid. I think that it's hard sometimes in bigger systems to really maintain this unless you have whole school communities really involved. And the struggle that I've experienced in New York City is that I'm very much in a silo doing this. So being in a big school, being the only teacher who's approaching learning with this mentality is challenging for people, because ultimately, if we want it to be sustainable, if we want kids to buy in, if we want families to buy in, it's really got to be a whole school, a whole system that's doing this so that there's more capacity and more support. I know that in October I will be working with a school in Canada, and basically their whole district is going gradeless, which I think is phenomenal. A couple of resources. The one that got me started thinking about my grading practices was Ken O'Connor's 15 Fixes for Broken Grades, a grading toolkit. Really, really phenomenal, readable. I've written Hacking Assessment. Mark Barnes has written a bunch of different ones, Assessment 3.0, Role Reversal, also really great books to get you thinking. Rick Wormley writes about standards-based grading quite a lot, then he's a great resource. I've also written a book about self-assessment, teaching kids to self-assess, and there's a bunch of others out there that are really, really good. There are some really excellent blogs out there if you're not interested in buying a whole book, if you're just looking to get your feet wet at this point. There are also a bunch of TED Talks. Mark Barnes did a TED Talk about getting rid of grades, and I also did a TED Talk about getting rid of grades. As far as extra work, I think in the beginning when you're setting up systems, it definitely creates more work, but as an English teacher and a high school English teacher, there's a lot of work anyway with assessment. So when you are doing it, it becomes more sustainable and it becomes more meaningful. Plus, when kids are more involved, it actually becomes less work. And when you're seeing work all along the way, when you get the pile at the end, it's not as aggressive. You're not free, Sarah. So you're not free to really choose what you do. And I think it, in New York is the same thing, and I don't recommend this for folks who are untenured, but I certainly take a lot of risks with my kids in terms of trying things, apologizing later, really trying to show what's best for kids. Going back to Sean's question about resources, I also have a YouTube channel where I have a lot of student work, kids talking about their work, their portfolios, different ways that you could see what it looks like when kids are doing it, when they understand the language of the standards and when they're talking about their learning. And most of them, after teaching 12th grade for so many years, most of my students generally come back to me and tell me how prepared they felt as learners for everything that they were going to do after they left my class. And once we de-emphasize grades in the classroom, it really frees students up to focus on the learning. And they're not always, constantly focusing on points and trying to get things that just show compliance. And really that's what grades are. How well do you comply with what the teacher wants? Are you turning stuff in on time? Did you do your homework? Usually not very meaningful homework. Did you do the worksheets, which is a topic for a whole other conversation? So the more we really make learning meaningful, the more we de-emphasize grades, the more we use feedback in the classroom, the more reflection becomes a part of the practice, the more student voice is involved in this practice, the better off we are. So I'm really grateful everybody stopped by. Again, you could reach me at Miss Sackstein, really reachable on Twitter. I also have a Facebook page that you could get me at, Miss Sackstein. I think it's just straight up Starr Sackstein. You could, work me there. Does this system prep kids well enough for, I'm reading, Lorraine, what you've written there. I didn't get the after well enough for, I think it does prepare kids better than our current system is preparing them. As a matter of fact, I think kids are really adept at getting around the actual learning part. They take a test, they, basically cram for that test to get the good grade, and then they forget everything that they learned. So there's no depth of knowledge there, but they're applying. Whereas when we help kids become reflective learners, reflective people, it really helps them grow as individuals. And Sean, it's certainly not a bother. I hope you will be coming to talk to me on Twitter. I'd be happy to do that. Anyway, I hope everybody has a great night, and hopefully I'll get a chance to talk to you about this again soon. Have a good night.